The fire is small, low to the ground, built carefully in a stone pit just wide enough to hold a man's 2 hands side by side. The smoke curls upward and disappears into the dark, swallowed by a sky so thick with stars it almost looks bright. Almost. You are standing, or maybe crouching, at the edge of a military camp somewhere in the ancient world. It could be the plains of Persia. It could be the hills above Carthage. It could be the flattened, frost-hardened ground outside a Roman fortification in the 2nd century before the Common Era. The specifics will come. But first, just stay here for a moment. Feel the cold at your back and the heat at your shins. Feel the strange in-between of a night fire, the way it makes the world behind you vanish completely and pulls the world in front of you. The dancing shadows, the other crouching figures, the distant flicker of torches at the perimeter, into a strange golden intimacy. There are maps in this camp. You know this. Every soldier knows this. The kind of maps that took years to assemble, scouts on horseback for 6 months, conversations with river merchants, careful observations of mountain passes recorded in ink on dried animal skin. These maps show everything: supply routes, the position of Allied forces, the number of troops stationed at the eastern border and the western one, the weaknesses in the fortifications, the king's preferred line of retreat if the battle goes wrong. And here is the thing that should keep you awake, the thing that should make the hair rise on the back of your neck even here, even in the warmth of this fire. Someone in this camp is about to give all of it away. Not a spy who was caught lurking in the shadows, not a messenger who was ambushed on the road, not a soldier tortured into confession. No, the person who is about to hand over these war plans, the entirety of this empire's military intelligence, is someone the king trusts completely, a man who has eaten at his table, who has advised him in council, who has been given robes and titles and proximity to power that most people in this empire would trade their lives to possess. And tonight, in the dark, he is going to walk over to the other side. The question, the one that has haunted historians and philosophers and generals across 3,000 years of human civilization, is not whether this happened. It did happen, many times, in many forms, across cultures so distant from each other they never shared a word or a road. The question is, why? What is it about a trusted advisor, a man of intelligence and access and comfort, that makes him capable of this? What does he tell himself in the moment before he crosses the line? And what exactly does it cost an empire when the person closest to its secrets decides, quietly, deliberately, without a sword, to become its greatest enemy? Stay with me tonight. This is a long, dark, fascinating story, and it begins much earlier than you think. If you found your way here to Echoes of History tonight, whether you're lying in the dark, eyes half closed or tucked under a blanket while the world outside does whatever the world does, I'm genuinely glad you're here. A lot of people who listen to this channel use it to fall asleep, and I want you to know that this is exactly what Echoes of History is made for. These long, slow, wandering dives into history and human nature, the kind that carry you somewhere far away until you're not quite sure if you're listening or dreaming. That's the whole point. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, would you do that for me? It genuinely takes 2 seconds, and it means the next time your mind won't quiet down at night, there'll be something new waiting for you. It really does help more than you know. And before we go further, drop a comment. Tell me where you are in the world right now and what time it is. I read more of those than you'd expect, and there is something I find genuinely moving about knowing that someone in a city I've never visited at an hour when most of the world is asleep is lying there in the dark, listening to history. That matters. You matter. Now, let's go. Here is what almost everyone assumes about betrayal at the highest levels of power. That it is a crime of desperation, that it happens when someone has been pushed to the edge, starved, threatened, humiliated, left with no other option. We imagine the traitor as a frightened man, eyes wide, hands shaking, acting out of pure survival instinct, a cornered animal, a soldier who broke under pressure, someone who had no real choice. This assumption is wrong, dramatically, provably, historically wrong, and the evidence has been sitting in the archives for centuries, waiting for someone to look at it honestly. The most consequential acts of strategic betrayal in the ancient world, the ones that toppled empires, rerouted armies, and changed the course of civilizations, were almost never committed by desperate men. They were committed by comfortable ones, by men who had power, status, access, and a deep, burning conviction that they deserved more than they had, or by men who believed with absolute sincerity that the empire they were betraying had already betrayed them first. Or this is the strangest category of all, the one that historians keep stumbling over and struggling to explain, by men who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing, that handing over the war plans, the troop positions, the king's innermost strategic intentions was somehow an act of virtue. Take the case of Alcibiades, the Athenian general and statesman of the 5th century BCE, a figure so brilliant and so morally unmoored that even today, 25 centuries after his death, scholars argue about whether he was a hero or a catastrophe. Here was a man born into one of the most powerful families in Athens, raised in the household of Pericles himself, educated by the best philosophical minds of the ancient world. He had wealth, he had fame, he had a face that ancient sources describe, without embarrassment, with what sounds almost like awe, as extraordinarily beautiful. He commanded armies, he won naval battles. He was the kind of man that a city builds legends around while he is still alive. And he betrayed Athens, then he betrayed Sparta, then he betrayed Persia. Not out of desperation, not under threat. He switched sides with the casual grace of a man rearranging furniture in a room he owned, always landing in a new position of comfort and influence, always with a perfectly articulated explanation for why this new allegiance was, in fact, the morally correct one. Alcibiades is an extreme case, almost a caricature of the type. But he is useful precisely because he makes visible something that is usually hidden, because most of the advisors and generals and court officials who handed over empires in the ancient world did not do it with the theatrical flair of an Athenian golden boy. They did it quietly, in the dark, with no fanfare and no witnesses. And what the evidence actually shows when you look carefully at the archaeological record, the administrative texts, the diplomatic correspondence that has survived, is that the act of betrayal at the highest level was almost always preceded by a very long period of feeling overlooked, not threatened, overlooked. The trusted advisor who hands over the war plans is almost never a man who fears for his life. He is a man who has spent years watching someone else get the credit for work he did, who drafted the strategy that won the battle, then stood at the back of the room while the general received the gold wreath, who translated the foreign dispatches, identified the threat, advised the correct response, and then watched his counsel be received with a nod and immediately attributed to someone else in the public record. He is a man who has access to everything and ownership of nothing, who knows more than the king, serves at the king's pleasure, and will be forgotten the moment the king no longer needs him. That is the kindling. The match comes later, and the match is almost always personal. Let's go back to a specific night, a specific man, a specific act. The year is 499 BCE, give or take a year in either direction. Ancient dating is a complicated conversation that we'll set aside for now. The place is the court of Darius I, King of Kings, ruler of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had ever seen at that point, a political entity that stretched from what is now Greece and Egypt in the west to what is now Pakistan and Uzbekistan in the east. An empire of roads and post stations and standardized weights and measures, and an administrative apparatus so sophisticated that modern historians are still excavating its records with something approaching disbelief. At this court in the city of Susa, there is a man named Histiaeus of Miletus. He is not a Persian, he is a Greek, specifically an Ionian Greek from the western coast of Anatolia, the part of the Greek world that had come under Persian control a generation earlier, and he has been, for years, one of Darius's most trusted and useful advisors, trusted enough to have been given the governance of a city, trusted enough to have accompanied the Persian army on campaign, trusted enough to have been kept at court in Susa when Darius decided, as a precaution, as a kind of gilded captivity, that Histiaeus should remain close. And that gilded captivity was the kindling. Histiaeus was not a prisoner, he was a guest. He ate well and slept comfortably and was treated with respect and consulted on matters of Greek policy. But he was not free to go home. He was not permitted to return to Miletus, the city he had governed, the city where his name carried weight and his word was law. He had been gracefully, elegantly, permanently removed from the source of his power, kept useful, kept nearby, kept decorative. So Histiaeus made a plan, and the plan, this is the part that sounds almost too theatrical to be true, except that Herodotus records it, and modern scholars largely accept the basic framework, involved shaving the head of a trusted slave, tattooing a message directly onto the man's scalp, waiting for the hair to grow back, and then sending him to Miletus with instructions to have his head shaved upon arrival. The message, hidden under a full head of hair, walked through every Persian checkpoint on the road to the Aegean coast. It passed guards and inspectors and the entire surveillance apparatus of the most powerful empire in the world. And it arrived in Miletus where it triggered the Ionian Revolt, a massive, coordinated uprising of Greek cities against Persian rule that consumed the eastern Mediterranean world for the next 6 years, and ultimately pulled Athens and Sparta and Persia into a conflict that would reshake the entire arc of Western civilization. Think about that for a second. One man, sitting in a comfortable room in the Persian capital, feeling overlooked, feeling reduced, feeling like a beautiful piece of furniture in someone else's house, sent a message on a man's scalp and started a war. Not because he was threatened, not because he was starving, because the version of himself that existed inside that palace was so much smaller than the version he believed he deserved to be. The war plans he handed over were not written on parchment. They were something more dangerous, institutional knowledge, the knowledge of how Persian power actually worked, where it was secure and where it was brittle, which regional governors were loyal and which were resentful, what the empire's response time looked like when crisis appeared on the coast. Histiaeus had spent years absorbing this knowledge in service of the empire, and when the time came, he used every bit of it against his patron. Darius, for his part, apparently refused to believe it for a long time, because this is the other thing the evidence shows. The betrayed king almost never sees it coming. Not because he is foolish, but because trust, once established, functions as a kind of cognitive filter and makes certain information literally invisible. The warning signs that would be obvious to an outsider are invisible to the person inside the relationship. The trusted advisor, who is quietly building his escape route, does so in plain sight, protected by the assumption that someone so close, someone so valued, someone with so much to lose, would never. They always do. But Histiaeus was not finished. When the revolt he'd ignited began to go badly, he convinced Darius to send him to the coast to resolve it, presenting himself with stunning audacity as the one man capable of putting out the fire he had started. Darius, remarkably, agreed, and Histiaeus spent his final years playing all sides simultaneously, never quite belonging to any of them, until he was captured by the Persians and executed, and Darius, according to Herodotus, had his head preserved in honor rather than shame, because the king could not bring himself to treat the physical remains of a man he had loved as a traitor, even after the betrayal was beyond dispute. There is something in that detail that is almost unbearably human. The king who could not let go. The advisor whose head was embalmed and honored even as his memory was officially condemned. The two men bound together across death by the very trust that one of them had destroyed. This is where history stops being a collection of facts and becomes a mirror. Now here is where it gets strange, because the story of Histiaeus is remarkable, but it is not unique. It is not even particularly unusual. What the historical record reveals when you start to look at the pattern rather than the individual cases is that the phenomenon of the trusted insider turning against the power that elevated him is not a bug in the system of empires. It is a feature. It happens with such regularity across such vastly different cultures that it starts to look less like a series of individual moral failures and more like a structural inevitability. Something built into the architecture of power itself. Consider the Tang Dynasty court of 7th century China, a civilization that developed one of the most sophisticated systems of bureaucratic administration in human history. The imperial examination system, the elaborate hierarchy of ministers and advisors, the strict protocols around court access, all of it was designed, in part, to prevent the kind of dangerous intimacy that the Persian court had permitted with Histiaeus. The Tang emperors understood instinctively that knowledge is a form of power, and that anyone granted access to the emperor's strategic thinking was, in a sense, being handed a weapon. And yet, there was a man named An Lushan, not an advisor in the traditional sense, but a military governor of enormous trust and personal affection to Emperor Xuanzong, who in 755 CE launched a rebellion that nearly destroyed the dynasty entirely. An Lushan had spent decades at court. He was famously jovial, physically enormous, theatrically fond of the emperor, and reportedly entertaining enough to make the court laugh in ways that more formal men could not. The emperor adored him. The emperor's favorite consort, Yang Guifei, reportedly treated him as an adopted son. He was given 3 military commands simultaneously. He had more troops under his control than any single official in the empire. He knew the court's internal politics, its weaknesses, the relationships between ministers, the emperor's moods and blind spots. He had been handed piece by piece over years of accumulated trust, an almost complete picture of how the empire's defenses actually functioned. And then he used it. The An Lushan rebellion lasted 8 years. It is estimated to have killed somewhere between 13 and 36 million people, one of the deadliest conflicts in the history of the ancient world, and one that left the Tang dynasty permanently weakened, never again reaching the heights of its early glory, all of it traceable in some direct line of causation to the intimate trust of one emperor for one man who found himself with too much power, too much knowledge, and a constellation of grievances that had been quietly accumulating for years. Here is what the evidence actually shows when you look at the pattern across the Persian, Chinese, Roman, Byzantine, and later Ottoman courts. The most dangerous moment in the life of an empire is not when it faces a powerful external enemy. It is when the internal circle of advisors becomes so densely packed with knowledge, so intimate with the king's thinking, that they begin to believe, not wrongly perhaps, that they understand the empire better than the emperor does, that they are, in some fundamental sense, more essential to its survival than the person who wears the crown. This is not paranoia. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is recorded in administrative text and court documents, and the careful assessments of ancient historians as a recurring reality. The Tang bureaucracy tried to solve it with examinations and rotation of positions. The Byzantine court tried to solve it with elaborate systems of mutual surveillance, with eunuch administrators who could hold power but had no dynastic ambitions, with a culture of mistrust so profound and so ritualized that it became its own kind of art form. The Roman Empire tried to solve it with loyalty oaths and the cult of the emperor's divine status and the deliberate cultivation of competing factions within the court, so that no single advisor ever had the full picture. None of it worked. Not entirely, because the thing they were trying to prevent was not fundamentally a political problem. It was a human one. It was the problem of what happens when a person knows too much, is rewarded too little, and begins to do the math. Zoom out for a moment. Think about every institution you have ever been part of. Not an empire, probably, nothing so grand, but any organization where knowledge was unevenly distributed and recognition was unevenly given. Think about the person who trained the new hires and never got promoted, the analyst who wrote the report that the manager presented to the board, the advisor in any meeting, in any office, in any century, who left the room watching someone else receive credit for a decision they had essentially made. That person is not usually a traitor. Most people, in most circumstances, absorb that kind of slight and move on. They recalibrate. They find meaning in other places. They build a story about their situation that allows them to keep functioning. But some of them, the ones who are most capable, the ones who are most aware of the gap between what they contribute and what they receive, begin, very quietly, to look for another door. Here is the strangest dimension of this story, and the one that I find most difficult to put down once I've picked it up. Almost all of these men, Histiaeus and Lucian, and the dozens of others scattered across the historical record who handed over plans and maps and secrets and strategies to the empire's enemies, almost all of them had a justification. Not an excuse, a justification. A genuine, internally consistent moral argument for what they were doing. Histiaeus told himself and probably believed that he was the rightful governor of Miletus, that Darius had stolen something from him, and that the revolt he was inciting was a corrective action, a restoration of a natural order that had been disrupted by Persian overreach. He was not, in his own mind, a traitor. He was a man taking back what was his. And Lucian's motivations are more complex and more debated, but the evidence suggests that he genuinely felt that certain court factions had been maneuvering against him for years, that his military successes had been minimized, his rivals elevated, and that the emperor he loved had been slowly turned against him by jealous ministers. He was not, in his own telling, starting a rebellion. He was launching a correction. He was going to remove the bad advisors and restore the emperor's court to what it should be. Think about that framing for a moment, because it is deeply, uncomfortably recognizable. The person who harms the institution while claiming to save it. The insider who destroys the thing they love in the name of protecting it. Who hands over the war plans, not because they hate the king, but because they have decided somewhere in the privacy of their own mind that the king's current advisors are unworthy, that the current course is wrong, and that the disruption they are about to cause will ultimately lead to something better. History is full of people who broke things in the name of fixing them. And what makes the trusted advisor betrayal so philosophically disturbing is that this person, more than almost any other, has the information required to make a compelling argument for why they were right. They know the internal workings. They have seen the corruption or the incompetence or the favoritism up close. Their grievances are often, in important ways, legitimate. They are not entirely wrong about the problems they identify. They are simply catastrophically wrong about the solution. There is a Greek term, and this is not coincidental, given that some of the most discussed cases come from the Greek world, for a moment of excessive pride that leads to destruction, hubris. But hubris, as it's usually understood, is the pride of a king, a hero, a person in the highest position who overreaches. What the trusted advisor commits is something different. It is the hubris of the indispensable man. The hubris of the person who has looked at the institution they serve and concluded, privately, that it cannot function without them, and that this knowledge gives them rights that supersede their obligations. The Byzantines, who developed perhaps the most sophisticated political philosophy of betrayal in the ancient world out of sheer practical necessity. Since the Byzantine court was essentially a competitive sport of strategic alliances and strategic backstabbing, had a concept for this. They called it the problem of the polymath advisor, the man who knows too much. Because once an advisor crosses a certain threshold of knowledge, they stop being a tool of the emperor and start being a rival. Not in ambition, necessarily, but in capacity. In the ability to imagine an alternative arrangement of power in which they are not at the back of the room. The Byzantines tried to prevent this by keeping their most dangerous advisors close, terrifyingly close, embedded in the palace itself, surrounded by surveillance, while simultaneously making sure they could never coordinate with each other. Divide the knowledge, divide the loyalties, never let any single person hold the complete map. It worked for a while. Empires rarely collapse from a single betrayal. They collapse from many layered over decades, each one opening a crack that the next one widens. And eventually, the cracks are structural, and the building comes down. What none of the ancient empires, Persian, Chinese, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, ever fully solved was the underlying problem, which is not really a political problem at all. It is a problem of human recognition, the need, not just for power and comfort, but to be seen as essential. To be known, truly known, for what you actually contribute. To have your knowledge acknowledged not just in private, in the room with the king, but publicly, durably, in a way that outlasts the moment. We are still solving this problem. We are still, in every organization and every institution and every relationship on earth, trying to figure out how to make the most knowledgeable, most indispensable person in the room feel that their contribution is visible, valued, real. We have not figured it out. And until we do somewhere tonight in some organization too large to name and too important to fail, there is a trusted advisor looking at a map they helped draw and wondering whether there is someone else who would appreciate it more. Let's come back to you, not the ancient general, not the Byzantine polymath. You, think about the last time you knew something important, genuinely important. The kind of information that would have changed a decision if it had been heard, and it wasn't heard. Maybe you said it and it was ignored. Maybe you didn't say it because you already knew it would be. Either way, the knowledge sat inside you, unused, and you watched the decision go forward without it, and something in you shifted slightly. That shift is ancient. It is one of the oldest feelings in the human experience, and it is not small. What the history of trusted advisor betrayals reveals about modern psychology is this. The need for recognition is not vanity. It is not weakness. It is a fundamental human drive that is as real and as powerful as hunger or fear. Neuroscientists studying what they call the social reward system have found that recognition, being seen, being credited, being acknowledged, activates the same neural reward pathways as food and physical safety. The brain literally processes public recognition as a survival resource. Because for most of human evolutionary history, to be acknowledged as valuable within your group was to be protected by your group. To be overlooked was to be one step closer to being left behind. The trusted advisor who betrays his emperor is, on some level, following an instruction that was written into human biology long before empires existed. The instruction is, if the group you belong to is not recognizing your value, find a group that will. What makes this tragic, rather than simply villainous, is that the answer these men found was almost always the wrong one. Histiaeus died captured and decapitated, his rebellion having failed and Miletus having been destroyed in the process. And Lucian was murdered by his own son before his rebellion succeeded in any lasting way. The Byzantine polymath, who accumulated too much knowledge and too much resentment, almost always ended in either exile or execution, having gained nothing and destroyed much. The empire was not saved, and neither was he. And yet, the pattern repeats. Century after century, culture after culture. The lesson is available to anyone who has ever read a history book, and yet the lesson is not learned, because the lesson is not really about strategy or politics. It is about something that strategy and politics cannot address. It is about the experience of invisibility, of doing real, meaningful, consequential work and feeling in your body, in the deep animal part of your psychology, that it does not count. What did we lose when these men defected? We lost their knowledge. We lost the specific, irreplaceable intelligence of people who had spent years learning the internal grammar of an empire, its rhythms, its weaknesses, its genuine strengths. We lost not just their loyalty, but their perspective, which was often the most honest perspective available, because the person closest to power sees it most clearly. What did we gain? Occasionally, very occasionally, the disruption caused by a trusted advisor betrayal led to real reform. The Ionian Revolt, for all its horror, established precedents for Greek resistance to Persian expansion that made possible the battles of Marathon and Thermopylae a decade later. The weakening of the Tang dynasty after the An Lushan rebellion shifted China's political and philosophical center of gravity in ways that some historians argue made possible the reforms of the Song dynasty 3 centuries later. History is not a simple ledger. The costs and the benefits do not cancel each other out, but the pattern, if you look at it honestly, suggests something uncomfortable. That the most consequential restructurings of power in the ancient world were not engineered by visionaries. They were triggered by men who felt overlooked, who made the calculation, usually wrong, often fatal, that the empire that had not seen them deserved to be shown what it had missed. This is not a justification. It is an observation, and it is an observation that sits uncomfortably close to home. The fire is lower now. The camp has gone quiet. Most of the figures you saw earlier have moved to their tents, and the ones who remain are sitting in silence watching the coals. The smoke is thinner. The cold has moved closer. Somewhere in this camp, someone knows something they haven't said yet. That is the thing about secrets at the highest level of power. They don't announce themselves. They don't walk through the camp with their arms out, shouting their intentions. They sit quietly by the fire, looking exactly like loyalty. They eat breakfast with the general. They answer questions with precision and efficiency. They give good counsel in the morning meeting and nod thoughtfully when the strategy is discussed. And then, in the dark, they make a different calculation. The ancient world didn't have the word whistleblower. It didn't have the legal framework or the philosophical vocabulary to distinguish cleanly between the traitor who hands over plans for personal gain and the advisor who reveals wrongdoing at great personal cost. It didn't have the institutional structures, the oversight bodies, the independent courts that we have built imperfectly, slowly, over centuries to try to create legitimate channels for the uncomfortable truth. What it had was fire and darkness and the long, slow wait of feeling that you know something important, that this knowledge is a burden and a gift, and that the institution you serve either cannot or will not hear it. What it had was human nature, which has not changed. Somewhere in this exact world, tonight, not in 499 BCE, not in 755 CE, but tonight, there is a person who knows something they haven't said, who has access to information that would change things, that might need to change things, and who is sitting with it in the dark, doing the math, trying to decide whether the cost of speaking is worth the possibility of being heard. Most of them will say nothing. Most of them will recalibrate, find meaning in other places, build a story about their situation that allows them to keep going. This is not cowardice, this is survival, and it is what most people do, in most circumstances, in every civilization that has ever existed. Some of them, though, the ones for whom the weight becomes too much, or the calculation tips in a direction they didn't plan for, will find a different door. And the thing about history is that the ones who found the different door are the ones we remember, not always with admiration, not always with condemnation, but with this uncomfortable mix of recognition and unease that we feel when we see ourselves in a story that should have nothing to do with us. When Darius had Histius's head preserved and honored, even after the betrayal was confirmed, he was not being irrational, he was being human. He was acknowledging, without words, that the relationship they had shared was real, that the man who betrayed him had also genuinely served him. That trust is not negated by betrayal. It is made strange by it. It becomes a different kind of thing, something that can no longer comfort you but cannot quite be put down. Think about that for a second. The truest thing about trust is not that it protects you from betrayal. It is that it makes betrayal possible in the first place. Without trust, there are no war plans in the same room as the advisor. Without intimacy, there is no access. Without the genuine relationship, there is nothing to destroy. The betrayal is only possible because the trust was real, and so in a way that is almost too strange to hold in your mind all at once. The very act of betrayal is a kind of evidence that the relationship it destroyed was real, that the king's confidence in his advisor was not misplaced so much as ultimately insufficient, not enough to survive the weight of all that unacknowledged knowledge, all that invisible labor, all those years of feeling present but unseen. That is the mirror that this history holds up, not to kings particularly, to all of us, to every relationship in which knowledge is shared unequally. Every situation in which one person holds the map and another person gets the glory. Every moment in which the person who knows the most receives the least recognition. The ancient world built empires on the labor of people who were never named, and some of them eventually handed over the plans. Let the breath slow now. The fire is just coals, a faint orange glow, barely enough light to see your hands by. The camp is still. Think about where you are right now. Your body in the bed. The particular weight of the blanket. The temperature of the room. The faint sounds that belong to your specific corner of the world. Traffic or wind, or the settling of a house, or the breathing of someone nearby. You are here, in this moment, in the dark. Somewhere, very far away in time, a man named Histius sat in a comfortable room in Susa, in the Persian capital, and felt the gap between who he was and who he believed he should be. He made a choice. The choice had consequences that neither he nor Darius nor anyone else in that empire could fully predict. The world shifted, and then the world kept going. Empires rose, empires fell. Men handed over maps and kings preserved the heads of their betrayers, and the stars kept burning overhead, and the fires kept going low, and the cold kept coming in from the edges of every camp, on every plain, in every century of human history. You are lying under that same sky. The stars above you tonight are the same stars that burned over Susa, over Chang'an, over Constantinople, over every night fire where someone crouched in the dark and made a decision that echoed for centuries. The light reaching you right now, the specific photons passing through your atmosphere tonight, left their source before any of these empires existed. Before Histios, before Anlushan, before Darius and Xuanzong and every king who ever learned too late that the person closest to his power was also the person most capable of destroying it. The stars do not know about empires. They burn. They have always burned. Your breath slows, in and out. The coals are almost dark now. Somewhere in the ancient dark, a trusted advisor pulls his cloak tighter and looks up at the same sky you're looking at right now, or the sky just above the ceiling of the room where you're lying, and he makes his calculation. And the calculation will change the world, and the world will keep going anyway. Keep going. Close your eyes. The fire is out. The night is very old and very quiet, and you are safe inside it. Thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with Echoes of History tonight. If this episode helped you drift off, or if you learned something that surprised you and sat with you in the dark, a like on the video genuinely helps this channel more than you might think. It tells the algorithm that this is worth sharing, and sharing means more people get to fall asleep to history, which feels like a good thing for the world. And I would love, I really mean this, to hear from you in the comments. Where are you right now? What time is it? What's on your mind after all of this? I read every single one, and there is something that I find profound about the community of people who gather in the comment section of a sleep history channel at 2 in the morning. You are a specific kind of human, and I am genuinely glad you exist. If you haven't subscribed to Echoes of History yet, please do. It's the easiest way to make sure there's always something here when the night gets long and the mind won't settle. And if you'd like to support the work more directly, there is a channel membership available. No pressure, no obligation, just a quiet way to keep this going if it's given you something. Now, rest. Humans have been lying down at the end of the day underneath the same turning sky for as long as there have been humans. They've been telling each other stories in the dark since before the first empire rose or fell. And tonight, like every night, the dark holds you. The fire is out, the stars remain. Sleep now.